Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're glad to have with us again for this series my friend and colleague Jim Kenny, who will be talking with us informally about cultural evolution in our time. The ideas we'll be discussing are developed in depth in Jim's book, which is available on Kindle. It's called Thriving in the Crosscurrent: Clarity and Hope in a Time of Cultural Sea Change. Now, for those of you who were not with us in section 1 last time, Jim Kenny is founder and executive director of the Interreligious Engagement Project. He is co-founder and executive director of Common Ground, an adult educational organization and study center. He is founding trustee of the International Committee for the Peace Council, which brings together some of the world's most revered and influential religious and spiritual leaders in service to world peace. He is also co-editor of Interreligious Insight, a journal of dialogue and engagement, and former founding trustee and global director of a Council for a Parliament of the World's Religions. So today we're going to be addressing some issues in section 2 of this series. As Jim, you introduce us to the notion of sea change. You say that we need to understand the phenomenon of cultural evolution in terms of two waves. One, a declining wave representing an older, top-down cultural values, assumptions, predispositions, ways of seeing and behavior, an older model. And secondly, a rising wave representing a new emerging bottom-up values, ways of seeing and behaviors. So I think that you should please go on to elaborate on those. And also, if you could remind us a little bit about the premise of sea change in order to provide some context for today's information.
Great. Okay, last week I talked about the idea of cultural evolution. And I said that the first and most important premise that I want to address, and that's addressed in my book, is that cultural evolution is real, that it really happens, it happens all the time, and that by cultural evolution, I simply mean that the dominant human values, our most important cultural values, slowly move in the direction of a closer fit with reality. Now, I'm not saying all our behaviors are modified in appropriate ways or that our institutions get better and better every day. What I am saying is that our values steadily change, and they change by moving toward a closer fit with our ever deepening understanding of reality. So as a good example would be that over time, although it persists throughout almost all of human prehistory and history, we get to the point where we realize that slavery is always and everywhere wrong. Now, that doesn't mean that slavery has completely disappeared from the planet. There are still little pockets, but everyone realizes that the legitimacy of the idea of slavery is long gone. Another value shift that we have all lived through, and one of the most radical that any single generation or two, let's say, in human history has ever witnessed, is the shift away from absolute patriarchal domination of our culture and the gradual understanding that we need to change our approach to the status of women, the relationship between the genders, the role of women in society, and so on. I'm the first to acknowledge that we have a lot still to do. There's a long way to go, but anyone who remembers how it was in the 60s and in the 50s must acknowledge how dramatic that shift has been. By the same token, although we're in a period of tremendous racial stress and grief and conflict, nevertheless, think how far we have come. We are moving in the direction of post-racialist values. And another that I think needs to be mentioned is that if we go back to the 50s and 60s, the idea that the earth was fragile and that human beings and human culture might have some responsibility for her care and nurture, that was a very foreign idea that was endorsed by only a handful of people. Today, astonishingly enough, do you know that 75% of Americans consider themselves environmentalists? Now, on the one hand, that's kind of silly because they're not. But on the other hand, how much better is it that 75% of us think we are or want to be? What if it were 10? So changes are underway. But the sea change business comes in precisely because I believe that cultural evolution is punctuated. I think it's always going on. And the two-wave pattern that we're going to talk about, and we'll show you a graphic that will help you get a hold of it, the two-wave pattern, the decline of older values and the rise of newer, is sort of always in the background. But every now and then in human history, and in the book, I say this is a very rare occurrence. I talk about only 4 periods when I'm convinced it happened. And maybe there were more, but at least 4, and we're in one now. Every now and then, that process of cultural evolution is dramatically accelerated. It gets faster and deeper and broader, and I will actually dare to say better. We're in one of those periods now, and I use the term sea change to describe it. Sea change is only the first watery metaphor I use. We're going to talk about 2 waves, an outgoing wave and an incoming wave, and we're going to talk about a pattern of resistance to the change I'm talking about that I characterize as eddies. Eddies are counterclockwise whirlpools that desperately try to reverse the prevailing current of a stream. They never succeed, but they cause a lot of mischief along the way. And eddies, as we'll see a little bit more next time, are the patterns of resistance to the sea change, to the acceleration of the decline of older values and the rise of newer values. So here's a couple of paragraphs that I read last time to sort of tease what I'd be talking about today. And if I may, imagine an ocean moment. 2 waves converging in the same time and space. One is powerful, but subsiding. The other just gathering momentum and presence, but not yet cresting. At the moment of their meeting, they're nearly equal in amplitude and influence. As they cross, who can say which is rising, which descending? In that moment of the crossing, only the chaos of wave interference seems to exist. Now imagine modernity as a powerful wave of cultural values that crested half a century ago, and which is slowly beginning to subside, that wave. At the same time, a second wave of countervailing values rises equally slowly, building until its crest begins to rival the declining energy of the older wave. In Western culture, the modern wave has long been dominant. Deeply rooted in classical antiquity and European history, the modern wave, that's the older one, the modern wave, has profoundly shaped every culture in the world. In our own time, however, we've begun to sense the awakening of its, the weakening of its influence, and to recognize the growing strength of a challenging newer wave. The younger wave represents positive change. It's the wave of future possibility in the present, the advent of a cultural evolutionary transformation. So that's what we want to talk about a little bit today. I'd also like to talk about how we can identify a genuine moment of cultural evolution or sea change. People often ask me, they say, well, is the advent of computers, is that cultural evolution? And I say, no, that's a change in our cultural technology, and it can go either way. You have to ask, what's the influence on values? And I want to make that straight. What sorts of benchmarks could we bring to bear when the question arises? And I'll give you a good example, but when the question arises, is this moment, is this thing that has happened really a sea change moment, really a cultural evolutionary moment, or is it just a technological shift or a shift in mood and that sort of thing? So we have a graphic that I think would be helpful. It's a 2-wave graphic. And if Barbara can put it up. And there it is. Now, this is in a sense more complicated than it needs to be. Actually, it needs to be this complicated, but not perhaps at this exact moment. I want you simply to pay attention, forget all the little notations, and just pay attention to the dominant crystallizing wave that is beginning to break. Do you see it's beginning to decline? The high flat position of that wave at the beginning, where it says dominant and crystallizing. By crystallizing, I mean it's been dominant so long that it's beginning to crystallize. It's beginning to become stuck, to become inflexible, and that presages its decline. That dotted line, by the way, simply represents the point in time at which we suddenly become aware that the older wave is declining. And for my money, that line is somewhere in the 1960s. The decline is well underway long before that, but it's only in the 60s that we begin to notice it. And we'll talk about this a little bit more. Among the older values, and you see what the wave represents, the older values are long dominant. As long as that line is flat, that means they are essentially unchallenged. They are the values that are held and prized by the great institutions of society, government, religion, education, and so on. And virtually everyone, not everyone, but almost everyone, adheres to those values or at least gives them lip service. But gradually, they began to decline in influence. The biggest single reason why the older values decline in influence is the gradual buildup of anomalies. An anomaly is a wonderful word. It comes from the Greek. The Greek word for law is nomos. And when you put an A in front of a Greek word, it's like un or non. It's a negative prefix. So an anomos is something that's against the law or breaks the law, or in this case, breaks our expectations. An anomaly is something that actually happens, but which our values, the values in place, tell us can never happen. So the best example perhaps would be the anomaly that presages the decline of patriarchy, when in the 19th century, actually some had noticed it much earlier, but in the 19th century, society at large began to attend to the fact that women were not inferior in all of the ways we had assumed. By the time we get into the first quarter of the 20th century, we're approaching a majority of Americans, at least certainly a majority of women, who are no longer sold on that patriarchal idea. Gradually, as we move into the 20th century, we begin to realize that Earth is not, as the older values had assumed, unfragile. It is fragile, and we play a role in enhancing that fragility and causing the deterioration and the degradation of Earth's ecosystem. So anomalies begin to pile up. The older values had long assumed that things like social and economic justice and human rights were simply out of reach. There's no way that human society could ever be cajoled into going after or trying to achieve values like that. By the time we get into the 20th century, there are too many counter examples, too many examples of strides, great strides having been taken to move us toward social and economic justice and human rights. Not the least of which, by the way, is the work that was done by Eleanor Roosevelt and others that crystallized in 1948 when the United Nations promulgated its Universal Declaration of Human Rights. An incredible turning point in the 20th century. Well, let me just say that at the same time that all of that is happening, a newer set of values is moving in to fill in the gaps left by the decline of the older set. And where anomaly, do you see how this works? Where anomaly is what presages the decline, the aha experience is what announces the rise of the newer set of values. The anomaly involves the discovery that things we had assumed to be true just aren't. An anomaly is something that is true that shouldn't be true. An aha experience is the discovery of a new way of looking at something we've looked at for a long time. So women should be taking their place in society. Human beings have a responsibility for ecological sustainability. And a big we might just be able to do more along the lines of social and economic justice and universal human rights. Okay, we can we can drop the graphic for a moment because I want to use my arms to represent this. And you've got the one wave that's coming. Actually, am I doing this the right direction for you? There's the older wave going out, and here comes the newer wave coming in. But the moment I'm interested in is the point of crossing. At a certain point, the older wave on the way down and the newer wave on the way up are going to be roughly equal in influence, which is to say, figuratively, they're going to cross. And the older wave, I mentioned this last week, but I want to say a little bit more. The older wave still has, for the most part, control over institutions, still dominates a lot of human assumptions and behavior, but it is in decline. So what it's got going for it is inertia. We've always done it that way, and if it's not so comfortable, at least it's familiar. But if the old wave has inertia as its energy source, the newer wave has momentum. And I think I said last week, give me momentum over inertia any day. Now, physicists among you will find fault with my juxtaposing inertia and momentum, and I just want you to know I know better, but metaphorically, I think it works very nicely. We'll be talking more. We'll see that graphic again, and we'll be talking more about, maybe you could put it up just for a second, Barbara. You'll see that the assumption is that as the two waves cross, the rising wave moves into a position of ascendancy, like the older wave had once occupied, and the older wave moves down and its values become essentially archaic. But the most important part of the graph is right at the center, and where I demonstrated that crossing. We have to ask ourselves, what would it be like to live at the moment when the older set of values, patriarchy, anti-sustainability, no global human rights or social justice, and the newer set of values that says all of those things need to be attended to, when those two sets of values cross and are roughly equal in influence, what would it be like to live at that time? And my answer is it would be exactly like today, because that's where we are. We're at that moment, that extended moment in time where older values and newer values are roughly equal. So what happens, we'll discuss this more next time, but what happens when that crossing takes place? Turbulence is the result. And under that center point, you see I've written the word turbulence. There are evolutionary surges taking place, and there are also counter-evolutionary, that looks like counter-revolutionary, but it's actually counter-evolutionary eddies, which are these whirlpools of resistance. When I was first talking about this to different audiences 10 years ago, I think they had a hard time visualizing what eddies would look like. I think it's easier today. We have a living eddy as the current occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. But there is, as we'll see, there is considerable hope and considerable reason to believe that the eddies, the apparent resurfacing of racism, the apparent sort of rebirth of a crude patriarchy, the apparent resurgence of white nationalist, human rights denying radicalism, I think it will discover that all of those, while very dangerous and very frightening and deeply disheartening and certainly displeasing, they are necessarily, I'm going to argue, necessarily temporary. I think the inertia will always fail in the face of the momentum. So, shall I go ahead?
Sorry, I was muted. I was thinking that before we move on to speaking about benchmarks and so on, that maybe that's a topic that we should reserve for the next in our series, section 3, so that we can get into it in some detail and not feel constrained by time. So maybe we could just finish out a discussion of the two-wave theory. And my question for you, and I'm sure because so many of our viewers are connected with spiritual communities, and they're starting to engage in what AG&T has been calling spiritually guided social activism, um, which of course is not different in the end of all other kinds of activism that are addressing human rights, social issues, the environment, everything that we're talking about here on a practical level. But the idea here is that in the past it may not have been sustainable because many of us realize that a deeply rooted system of values that we come to through our practice and understanding and insight within ourselves, and then share with a spiritual community that supports us, is a better foundation for activism than a more cosmetic, social, or political type of action, which may not be sustainable in the long run because its motivations are a little different. And we won't go into that now, but I guess my question for you for a moment, and then we'll finish up about the waves. But in light of waves, can you say how a more spiritually based, or the idea of conscious values and deeply held beliefs and choices about what is good for the earth and what humanity really stands for, will those kind of things be supported by this new view more than perhaps they have been in the past?
Well, I think so. I think yes, and I think that's a very good question. Let me see if answering it this way works. A little later on in the book, I talk about the fact that when people hear about this, when they hear the very simple premise that we're living in a time of accelerated cultural evolution, that our values are changing in progressive ways, and that's progressive with a small p, in ways that we would all applaud. And the rubric I have used for years to describe that is used by activists, people who are trying to make a difference worldwide, and it's the abbreviation PJS. And P stands for peace and nonviolent conflict resolution. J is justice, social and economic justice, and universal human rights. And S, PJS, S is ecological sustainability. Well, I introduce that, and then I say, but that message is very heartening to some, and they say yes, and I call them the yaysayers. But it's disheartening to others. It's threatening to others. It threatens their identity. It threatens their pursuit of wealth. It threatens their pursuit of power. It threatens their blissful oblivion. These are the couch potatoes I'm talking about of life, that I call the unexamined lifers. Plato said that an unexamined life was not worth living. And these people are not only not examining their lives, but they're serving a life sentence at it. So I call them the unexamined lifers. And that whole group of people I call the naysayers, because they hear about all this. They, first of all, deny that it could be true. And the reason is that they desperately don't want it to be true. So we're going to set them aside. We'll talk about them when we talk more in the next week, probably, about eddies. But the other side is interesting, and this is where I can answer your very good question. The yaysayers, I talk about 4 different sort of modes or moods of yay saying. And the first is a group I call the seekers. And the seekers are, they're giving their assent to this model because they've always known that the universe works this way. These are people who are deeply spiritually grounded and who want to be involved in making the world a better place. And so they really resonate with this model because it gives them some tools, for recognizing what's happening that's worth pursuing, and also gives them some, I think this is even more important, it gives them some tools for understanding the things that seem to suggest that we're going the other way. So many people, when they first hear about this, say, how can you possibly believe that anything is getting better when everything is getting worse? And my answer usually is, you need to listen to and resonate with your own outrage. If you and all your friends and all the people you know and trust were blasé about what's going on right now, then we'd be in trouble. But you're not. You're feeling a deep sense of outrage. That means your values have shifted. Our cultural values have shifted, and we see this backlash that's taking place that comes from the naysayer side. The backlash that's taking place, we find it disheartening and outrageous, and we want to rail against it and work against it and fight against it. That's a very positive sign. So the first group I identify are the seekers. Another group I identify, and they are hand in hand, and many times the seekers fall in this group as well. The actives, the people, and boy, the AG&T community that I have known and worked with for a long time and really admire is filled with actives, people who have been working in this area or that area, working on peace, working on nonviolence, working on social and economic justice, absolutely working on ecology. And actives are people who have been working hard to make a better world. But when spirituality and activism come together and join hands, you're absolutely right. You have a much stronger and deeper motivation. I talk about a third group too. Let me just throw this in. I call them the creatives. And this sort of flashes forward to what we'll talk about next time, because one of the benchmarks of a true cultural evolutionary change is a rise in complexity and a new awareness of interdependence. So the creatives, like the cultural creatives, these are people who really understand that we live in an interdependent universe and an interdependent world. And that's something that will resonate also with AG&T people. And that's another reason to give your, I think that, by the way, all of the people that say yay are probably, most of them are all of these things. But some would stress the commitment to interdependence. Some would stress the commitment to the spiritual search. Others would stress the commitment to activism. And there's still others who really want to be catalysts, who really want to make cultural evolution happen in the lives of other people. Now, those are all overlapping things, but you get a sense that every one of them resonates with spirituality and with spiritually motivated social engagement.
Wow, that's something I want to explore in more depth. So the fourth group is catalysts. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
I love this model, and I think we can work a lot more with this one too. It really answers my question, but it also brings up a lot of other questions that we'll have to save for a future section of the series, okay?
The book has an index. Look up yaysayers and naysayers.
Yeah, that's true. And again, we encourage everyone to get the book and read the full book too, because it'll make all of our sessions from here on in and beyond much more meaningful for you. Again, it's called Thriving in the Crosscurrent, Clarity and Hope in a Time of Cultural Sea Change. Before we wrap up today, I know there's a couple more things that we want to get to, but before we do actually close, is there anything else that you wanted to say about the two wave theory that we missed, or do you feel pretty complete on that?
I feel good about it. One of the things that you and I have agreed is that we will be putting that PDF of that graphic and perhaps other graphics up on your website. So people who begin this series will be able to download it and follow along. And chances are, as we go along in the next two sessions, I will be asking you to put that up again so we can take another look at it. But I think we got a good start on it today.
Yeah, me too. And I'll send everyone more details about how they can download these documents when they're available on our website. So today I know I'm going to ask Jim if he'll end with a poem by Seamus Heaney. Heaney? Heaney.
Mm-hmm.
It's from the book called The Cure at Troy. And I think that will be our invocation to bring us out of, invocation or benediction to bring us out of the session.
Seamus Heaney, who passed away a few years ago, was, in a sense, Ireland's poet laureate. He was Ireland's most beloved poet and a deeply spiritual man and a wonderful man. And I never met him, but I've seen him recite his poetry, and I absolutely love him. But he says, history says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then once in a lifetime, the longed for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. I just want to repeat that. Once in a lifetime, the longed for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that a further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and cures and healing wells.
Wow, that is very powerful. Is that included in the book?
It is, as
Ah,
it happens.
okay. Well, this is, again, this is something that probably we'll want to have for future reference to another piece. So that was a beautiful way to end the section today. So I guess I want to say thank you. That was
Thank
always
you.
interesting to me, and I hope everyone else. And to say thank you for everyone who's attending the series. We've got so much more to share with you in the coming weeks, so make sure that you stay tuned and tell others about it. Um, this is preface to a program that we're planning on providing for you in 2018 that has to do with new thought and new paradigm perspectives on what's happening actively in the news. And Jim will join us for, I hope, many of those sessions as well. So this is a new foundation we're building on, and I want to applaud all of you for caring enough to be here and doing some of the heavy lifting. And I want to thank Jim for being so generous as to share his wisdom with us. So until next time, bye-bye.